Welcome to Stoic Conversations. My name is Michael Tremblay, and today I'll be doing a solo podcast about the Ring of Gyges. The Ring of Gyges is a famous thought experiment from Plato's Republic, and it's one of my most favorite ideas that comes out of Plato, and especially the Republic. Something I think about consistently. I think about what it means for how we practice philosophy and how we interact with Stoicism in particular. And I thought I'd share it because it doesn't come from the Stoics. And so if you haven't had the chance to read Plato yet, you might not have encountered it. And even if you had, it's good to go and dig into it in a bit more detail. So, this is really takes the form of a story, which is something Plato loves to do. We think about the allegory of the cave, for example. Plato loves to tell these stories to draw out these philosophical themes. And so in this one, it's at the beginning of Plato's Republic. Socrates is attempting to define virtue. He's debating with Glaucon, Plato's brother, and Glaucon brings up a thought experiment in the form of an old myth. Gyges of Lydia was a herder of sheep when one day an earthquake opened up a chasm in the ground. He explored the chasm and found the tomb of a giant wearing a golden ring, which he took for himself. Upon inspecting the ring, he realized that when wearing it, he would turn invisible. He made his way to the court of the king of Lydia, and using the ring, seduced the queen and murdered the king. He became the king of Lydia. This is the Ring of Gyges. It's that ring that he found that turned him invisible. And we can think of it almost like the One Ring from Tolkien's Lord of the Ring. There seems to me there to be a really clear inspiration from the Ring of Gyges in the Lord of the Rings. But the point is, it's this ring that has the power to let you do or take whatever you want. So in this story, it turns you invisible, and maybe we think, okay, well, today we could catch invisible people. We could. It's not the strongest superpower in the world, but back in ancient Greek time, that was a pretty impressive thing to do. And so that's the point. Think of it like a ring that lets you do whatever you want. Glaucon, he takes this myth and proposes the following thought experiment. To quote from Plato's Republic, section 360, Glaucon writes, and this is a bit of a longer passage, "Suppose now that there were two such magic rings, these Ring of Gyges, and the just person put on one of them, and the unjust person put on the other. No man can be imagined to be of such an iron nature that he would stand fast in justice. No man would keep his hands off what was not his own, when he could safely take what he liked out of the market, or go into houses and lie with anyone at his pleasure, or kill or release from prison whom he would, and in all respects be like a god among men. Then the actions of the just would be the actions of the unjust. They would both come at last to the same point. And this we may truly affirm to be a great proof that a man is just, not willingly, or because he thinks that justice is any good to him individually, but of necessity. For wherever anyone thinks that he can be safely unjust, there he is unjust. For all men believe in their hearts that injustice is far more profitable to the individual than justice. And he who argues, as I have been supposing, will say that they are right. If you could imagine anyone obtaining this power of becoming invisible, and never doing any wrong, or touching what was another's, he would be thought by the lookers-on to be the most wretched idiot, although they would praise him to one another's faces, and keep up appearances with one another, from a fear that they might too suffer injustice." I think this is a great passage. Glaucon's point here is it's a challenge against the benefit of justice. He says that it seems we act justly not because it's good, but because we are weak. We can't get away with doing what we desire without consequences, so we, act in a just way to protect ourselves. As he says in the passage, anybody who has the ability to do an unjust thing and get away with it will do that thing. You think of it how, we will speed, and if we think we can get away with it. But if there's a cop car, we might slow down, something along these lines. And we just say, we just don't break the law there because we don't want to be punished. And if we had the power to do it without being punished, we would go and do it. The story is also trying to draw out that this is common sense, or at least it was common sense back in ancient Greece. Glaucon's arguing that if someone had the ring but didn't use its power, the normal person would judge them to be an idiot, even though they might praise them publicly because they want to be seen as the kind of person who praises justice. The story poses two questions for the Stoic. The first question is almost a descriptive question. It's, what would you do if you had the ring? So Cicero writes about Plato's example 300 years later in Book 3 of On Duties. Cicero says in Book 3, Chapter 39, quote, "But the force of the illustration of the ring is this. If nobody were to know or even to suspect the truth, when you do anything to gain riches or power or sovereignty or sensual gratification, if your act should be hidden forever from the knowledge of gods and men, would you do it?" That's the first question. What would you do if you had the ring? And when I used to teach this to undergraduates, or even present this the first time I heard this question, I thought this was the more interesting question. I thought it was almost like a test. The ring of Gyges is this thought experiment about how virtuous you are. And if you had temptation, would you stand up to it? You could think of that like Frodo with Tolkien's ring. Can you resist this power, this draw, or will you succumb to the temptation? And that's the way Cicero phrases the question. If you had the power, would you do it? But I don't actually think that's the interesting question. I think the more interesting question is the normative question of what should you do if you had the ring? Are you actually a fool if you have power and act justly? Or are you the fool for using that power, for being unjust, for hurting others, for taking what you want, for hurting those you hate? So I think the ring of Gyges, it's better thought not as a question of, how would you respond to temptation, not as a measure of your progress, but as this way to gauge what you really value. Most of us don't have to ask this question because most of us don't have the power to have whatever we want. We don't have a ring that turns us invisible. So we don't really know what we want in a vacuum. We're always constrained by our own limitations. But the question is, if you could get or do anything without consequence, what should you do? What does a happy life look like with perfect freedom, with perfect power? In other words, I think, are we only stoic because we aren't strong enough to be hedonists or tyrants? Are we only pretending stoicism is true to justify our own position in the world, our own, we can't take what we want, so we make up some sort of story about how it's not worth taking. And that's what Glaucon's arguing, at least in that passage of the Republic, is that, we pretend to like justice because it's consequentially the best thing to do from our weak, imperfect positions. But we would be a fool not to seize power if we ever had it. Plato spends the rest of the Republic trying to answer this second question, this normative question. What should you do if you have the ring? At the end of Republic, in Book 10, Socrates claims, "We have proved that justice in itself is the best thing for the soul itself, and that the soul ought to do justice whether it possesses the ring or not." It's really what most of the Republic as a work is working up towards, in this question of what should you do if you had the ring? And the position is argued for that, we should be just. That's argued for, but relatively simply. Plato argues justice in the soul is about balance. When we indulge in our desires, we damage our own souls. We put our soul out of balance. So, for example, when Gyges assaults or seduces a woman and kills her husband to become king, this is bad for Gyges, not because he will be punished. He becomes king after all. And not because he'll be punished in the afterlife either, but because it's bad for us, because a happy life is to have a healthy soul. It's to be a good, balanced person. And when you engage in your desires like this, you murder because you want to, you take what you want without consideration for other people, you become out of balance. You become really a slave to your desires. And Plato makes these analogies to tyrants and points to them and says, they aren't happy people. In today's age, we could ask the same kind of question, and you could look at celebrities or billionaires or rich and famous people and say, maybe these people have done great things, or maybe these people have a lot of power, but how many of them do you think are actually happier people or better people than even the average person or an average member of your community? And we might say that. We might look at these people and say, well, maybe they've got some things we want, but that's not necessarily a life I would trade places with immediately. And that would be Plato's argument is, you don't actually want to be a lot of these people because they're often craving more and more and more. They're never satisfied, and so they've accumulated, but they're not living well. This is also the Stoic argument, and I think it's a critical one. Stoics are not Stoics because they can't afford to be hedonistic or fear punishment from acting out or going after what they want. Stoics believe that happiness comes from being a good person. If given the ring of Gyges, the Stoic would not use it to do whatever they wanted. Or rather, they would recognize that not all wants are equal or the same. It's okay to want some things and it's bad to want other things. And not bad in terms of you hurt other people, but also selfishly, it's bad for yourself. It's not good for you. And this is why I like the ring of Gyges as an example. This is why I think it's a powerful thought experiment. You can use it as an exercise for yourself. You can ask yourself which parts of your life philosophy are contingent upon your current situation. Would you act differently if you had the ring? Then you can introduce the second question. Should you act differently? Should you be unjust if you had more power? And the Stoic answer is no. The Stoic answer is that we pursue good character. We want to be just people, kind people, courageous people. Not because we can't afford to be hedonists, but because this is what it means to be happy and to live well. And so to be Stoic it's not any sort of compromise. It's not any sort of, I'll do the best with what I have. The Stoic thinks that to be a good person is to live well. And that applies to everybody. So that's the key lesson I take from the ring of Gyges, is that if you can look at the person who has the ring, you can look at the person who has money, you can look at the person who has power and think, should they be using that power? Should they be acting unjustly? Is it basically, well, they've won at life, so they should take whatever they want? And, you haven't really internalized Stoicism until you think the answer is no. Until you think, if the person took the ring, like in Plato's example, if there was someone who took the ring and didn't use it, you didn't think they're a fool. You think, well, that's what they should do. Not just because it helps other people, but for themselves. That is when you've really started to understand Stoicism. That's when you can think of Stoicism not just as a tool to get what you want, to be thrown away if you have the power to not be Stoic anymore, or no, you don't need to be Stoic anymore, but as a real, genuine life philosophy. With that in mind, I'll go back to Glaucon's quote quickly. He says, "For all men believe in their hearts that injustice is far more profitable to the individual than justice, and he who argues, as I have been supposing, will say that they are right. If you could imagine anyone obtaining the power of becoming invisible, and never doing any wrong or touching what was another's, he would be thought of by the lookers-on to be a most wretched idiot." If Glaucon's right there, and the average person would look at someone with that ring and think they're an idiot, a wretched idiot, then I think that's the point of philosophy. It's to look at the person who gets the ring and doesn't use it as being wise, as understanding themselves, as understanding that virtue and character is in our benefit and in our interests. We can selfishly be good people because that is a good life for us, not just for others. And that's what I think about when I think of the ring of Gyges.
Thanks for listening to Stoic Conversations. Please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and share it with a friend. If you want to dive deeper still, search Stoa in the App Store or Play Store for a complete app with routines, meditations, and lessons designed to help people become more stoic. And I'd also like to thank Michael Levy for graciously letting us use his music. You can find more of his work at ancientlyre.com. And finally, please get in touch with us. Send a message to stoa@stoameditation.com if you ever have any feedback, questions, or recommendations. Until next time.